When I think of HBO's Chernobyl, I think of Jonah and the whale. The Bible story comes to mind, I think, because it is a story about venturing somewhere you should never rightly go, where it would be insane to go, but where if you didn't, you would die anyway. The series is of course framed as a dramatization of the real-life events that led up to and followed on from the worst nuclear disaster in history, but the show does more than simply mark the event's tragic loss of life. On its deepest level, it unmasks the universe we live in to reveal the apathetic horror that lies beneath. So, the first question you'll be asking yourself is, what do I mean by apathetic horror? It's not the kind of synopsis you will read on the show's thumbnail or on the back of the Blu-ray, but I want to coin this term to describe an attribute that I think is centrally important to the rich quality of HBO's presentation in this limited series. At face value, one would be forgiven for believing that Chernobyl is merely a well-produced drama centered on the events of the disaster, but beyond casual viewing, most will notice that beneath this uppermost layer of its narrative, it meticulously dissects two elements of the human experience of which an event like Chernobyl arouses strongly resonant emotions, those of suffering and of sacrifice. Chernobyl as a series makes a point to showcase these elements in abundance, with a clear intent to display just what the Russian government really did not want anyone at the time to see. Not only the dehumanizingly horrific effects of acute radiation poisoning, but the sheer number of people those involved had to turn to in order to prevent the crisis from escalating from one that was merely national to one that was global. Indeed, many of the firefighters, engineers, and other liquidators who limited both immediate and long-term damage from the disaster undoubtedly saved more lives than we can ever accurately account for, and that is due to the sheer unpredictability of how bad the impact may have been without them. This shifting perspective of lenses between suffering and sacrifice, which the producers lean into heavily, makes for a kind of central pivot around which the story is told, and is arguably the core of the show's meaning, that the effects of the Chernobyl disaster were far more excruciating, lasting, widespread, and potentially apocalyptic than we have come to remember in the 21st century, and particularly in the West. That said, however, the narrative, I think, goes at least one level deeper. Jared Harris, the actor who plays Legasov, commented to Deadline, and I quote, "The first episode is almost a horror story." In truth, I think that standalone sentence underestimates the sentiment. Chernobyl as a series is, in this vein, not so much a drama series as a veritable horror series. To we, living and breathing the very concept of radiation as a life-threatening force in the universe is otherworldly and alien to our lived experiences. Just like the destructive power of black holes or, say, a coronal mass ejection, radiation like that unleashed in Chernobyl is antithetical to our day-to-day lives, but unlike cosmological phenomenon forever far from our sight, and which have so little visual evidence we can relate to, the evidence of what exposure to unnatural levels of radiation can have on something as fragile as the human body can be represented very simply, and by extension of that simplicity, in its full and naked horror. Also, unlike black holes or coronal mass ejections, both of which could by all estimation decimate human life, the source of Chernobyl's horror can be seen, and in the show they tease out this alien source expertly. That which I'm speaking of is of course the exploded core of Reactor 4, which is almost presented as though the show's inanimate antagonist. And like staring into the gaping mouth of the devil himself, it is horrifying for we behind the screen to behold. Like Jonah and the whale, this segment of the show evokes another myth for me, that of Perseus and Medusa, where to merely look upon that which you know to be deathly is to commit oneself to death. Even now, to walk the halls of that place is near enough to die, not from a monster you can see, but one you will, after enough exposure, begin to feel, as it ravages its way through you and decays the individual cells in your body. This deepest layer of the narrative, as I identify it, has a much more desperate message to the viewer, that nuclear disaster may one day be the apocalypse we bring about ourselves. Black holes, supervolcanoes, coronal mass ejections, These humanity-threatening phenomena are, by and large, beyond our control. If we die to them, then there will have been little to nothing we could have done. But nuclear disaster, that is only ever brought about by us. In a sense, radiation on such a scale as Chernobyl, for example, is fundamentally unnatural. It exists and can exist only by the bending of mankind's will over nature, and thus, if it is to be mankind's undoing, it will be an undoing we deserve, and that brings with it its own brand of horror. What's fascinating about this potential undoing is that as a species, we are already preparing for it. In New Mexico in the United States, there is a site called the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, where nuclear waste is to be buried far beneath the earth and which will remain toxic for thousands of years. 2,000 feet below the surface, the waste will be stored in a huge complex of tunnels and caverns designed for one purpose: to leave irradiated material untouched for longer than our understanding of civilization has even existed. Knowing that the radioactive waste there would have to be stored for 10,000 years before being considered safe, the Department of Energy hired linguists, archaeologists, anthropologists, and even science fiction writers to aid them in the proposal of a warning system. One proposal was to etch these warnings into granite monoliths in various languages, but also in pictograms, such as of stick figures in distress. One proposed message is reported to be, "This place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed dead is commemorated here. Nothing valued is here. What is here was dangerous and repulsive to us. This message is a warning about danger." When the facility is full sometime in the next 10 to 20 years, the caverns will be collapsed and sealed with concrete and soil. The complex of buildings that currently mark the site will be removed, and it will become, as stated by American science fiction author and astrophysicist Gregory Benford, our society's largest conscious attempt to communicate across the abyss of deep time. What we are preparing for with this is the end of humanity as we know it, for a people whose culture is not our own to understand that they must not dig here. Dive down to the whale's depths and it will swallow you whole. I realised in writing the script for this video that the site is actually the opposite of a time capsule. A time capsule is designed to be opened, usually at some particular point in the future, but the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, however, is designed never to be opened. What sticks with me when I consider it in relation to Chernobyl the series is the wording dangerous and repulsive. By accepting nuclear power and its waste as a byproduct of our own endeavours, we are creating traces we fully admit are both dangerous and repulsive. And the fallout of a nuclear explosion is that in its most horrifying form. Horrifying because of its ability to decay human life in a way we can't even see, and which spreads like a disease, but even faster. Disease is in fact a great comparison here because its nature, virus or bacteria, is to spread. It is living and exists to propagate no less than humans do. The difference with nuclear fallout is that its spread does not rely on biology. Its nature is the fundamental deconstruction of the building blocks of the universe, and unlike a disease which cares, at least in the sense that on a biological level it is designed to reproduce, the decay that radiation brings about doesn't. It is not biology, but a whiplash of the universe upon itself. That concept is so alien to us, it is horrifying, and that is what I mean by apathetic horror. In present day, to reduce the spread of radioactive contamination from the wreckage, the Chernobyl site has been encased in what is commonly referred to as the sarcophagus, and it does feel appropriate to call it a sarcophagus, which was completed in December of 1986, a matter of months after the disaster took place that April. It was further enclosed as recently as 2017 with a larger enclosure that allows for more effective removal of reactor debris while containing the radioactive hazard. However, nuclear cleanup is not scheduled for completion until 2065, which will be almost 100 years after the event. If you think that is a long time, Reactor 4, where the explosion took place, will be radioactive for another 20,000 years, which is quite likely longer than it will take for the human race to destroy itself. As always, thank you so much for watching, and as an aside to the central part of this video, I do want to take a moment to respectfully gauge the death toll of Chernobyl, which is, due to varying levels of exposure and effects over time, actually quite difficult to calculate. Though the UN estimates that only 50 deaths can be directly attributed to the disaster, it has predicted that a further 4,000 might eventually die as a result of the radiation exposure, not to mention the suffering and death brought upon Ukraine's wildlife. That suffering is of course ongoing and, as you've heard, will continue for all life in the exclusion zone for another 20,000 years, just to give you another perspective on what the scale of this disaster really means. If you enjoyed my video, please do give it a like. I've had so many kind comments recently and it really means the world to me as a tiny channel, so thank you so much.